This video is sponsored by PCBWay. Hello there and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I'm going to be modding this beat up HP EliteDesk that I paid about 50 bucks for into a pretty cool home server machine. This computer has clearly seen better days and may or may not even work. Along with that, I have no idea what hardware is in it, making this a bit of a mystery computer. I was unable to tell any details about the hardware from the seller's listing, though now that I have it in, I can see that it's likely got some kind of a 4th generation Core i5 in it. So that's at least a bit of a baseline on what we're dealing with here. But that's enough about this computer from the outside. Let's quickly pop the panel off so that we can make sure everything is looking good inside before powering it on to test if it works. Inside the computer, nothing looked immediately off. However, the power supply was noticeably crooked, likely due to the massive dent on the back of the case right beneath that part of the unit. Since nothing stuck out as an immediate obstacle for turning the computer on, I plugged in a monitor, keyboard, mouse, and power. After pressing the power button on the front of the case, the CPU fan spun up, and a few seconds later, the computer displayed to the monitor. It gave a standard error for a computer that doesn't have any bootable device connected to it, meaning that so far, the system seems to be functioning completely normally. Alright, the computer is working, so this hasn't been a complete waste of money, and I can probably do something with this computer. Great. With its functionality confirmed now, I unplugged everything from the computer and started digging around in its internals. I discovered that there appears to be both a 3.5-inch drive bay as well as a 2.5-inch drive bay in the system, which is a nice change from some of the Dell computers that I'm usually working on, which only have one bay. Though this computer is a little bit bigger than those Dells because, if I'm not mistaken, this computer is of the DT or desktop form factor, whereas those Dells are small form factor or SFF machines. Moving on to some of the more key components in this system now, this computer came with a single stick of RAM, which turned out to be a 4GB stick of DDR3 RAM. Considering that I'm planning to turn this computer into a home server machine, which I'm going to give away to a friend of mine, 4GB of DDR3 is not going to be enough, so that will be upgraded. But what about our CPU? Does the chip that's installed in this system line up with the 4th generation Intel i5 sticker that's on the case? Well, after removing the heatsink and wiping off the thermal paste, I was able to reveal that the CPU installed in this computer does in fact line up with that sticker, as today we're working with an Intel Core i5-4670, a chip that I've actually never worked with before. I've worked with the i5-4590 many times, but I'm definitely interested in how this 4670 will compare once we run a benchmark on the system. But to get to that point, there's a lot of work that I want to do on this computer, starting with upgrading that single stick of RAM. I have a ton of 4GB sticks of DDR3 RAM, so I've grabbed a set of 4 4GB sticks to give this system a total of 16GB of RAM, which should be more than enough for some beginner home lab and home server tasks. There isn't too much more to do with this system now, at least in terms of work on the actual computing hardware that's installed, but I do want to try to work out some of the dents in the case and maybe even give it a paint job. Obviously, doing this will require that I remove all of the computer from the computer, and so I began to work on removing the platform from the case and stripping it of all of its cabling and other components. Everything came out quite easily, and I even uncovered a broken off clip from the plastic front panel, which I had heard rattling around in the system when I unboxed it, where it quickly got stuck and stopped rattling. With all of the components stripped from the case, it's almost time to hammer out some dents, but first I checked out the power supply. There was a very large dent on the side of the case that was making the unit sit in a skewed manner, but thankfully the power supply itself doesn't seem to be damaged. I also opened up the unit to check that none of the capacitors were beginning to fail, which is something you should only do if you really know how to be safe around high voltage devices, and I saw that everything inside the unit was looking just fine. And with that, now it's finally time to start hitting this case with a hammer. I did something similar to this quite a while back with a squished Dell, where there were some minor dents in the side panel and I hammered them out. However, there was a bit of a rippling that was left behind by the hammer, and I recall someone suggesting that I use 2 pieces of wood, one on top and one on the bottom, to avoid this. I tried doing this, but it seemed my blocks of wood were too soft, and hammering like this was also exceptionally loud. So I shifted back to using the bare hammer on the metal with a scrap piece of wood underneath it. And I'm not sure what I did differently this time, but I was able to bang most of the dents out to the point of it being almost entirely smooth without causing any other distortions in the metal, which I'm pretty happy about. I then shifted my attention to the main part of the case, where I started by using some pliers to bend the PCI Express expansion slot section back into shape. After a while, I got the metal a lot straighter and made the retaining latch thing clip into place relatively well. The only other part of the case that had been noticeably deformed was this spot on one of its sides where it clearly got hit by something very hard. I was going to try and fix this dent, however, due to the case's construction, it wasn't really possible to bang it out from the other side because of a second piece of metal in the way. So I chose to leave this dent alone, and even though it's quite an ugly one, it should be on the bottom of the computer most of the time. So now that the case's construction has been mostly reformed, I took it outside and gave it a quick paint job, which only got dropped in the grass while wet once. And finally, we're ready to reassemble the system with the mod that I've been mentioning throughout this video. I started by reassembling the release handle on the side panel, and quick tip if you're ever doing this, wear safety glasses when putting the spring on, because if you miss, these things will go flying and they will hurt. Thankfully, I got mine installed on the first try and was ready to reassemble the system with a front panel mod that I found on Thingiverse and that I think is pretty cool. I'll be leaving a link to the original creator of this model in the description because all credit for this 3D printed piece goes to them. But this mod is a new front panel for the computer that will allow me to attach 4 80mm fans to its front for some extra airflow. I'll be installing 4 of these 80mm fans that won't be speed controlled but shouldn't be exceptionally loud into this new front panel. And that's great, but I'm going to need a way to connect them to the system to get them power, because this motherboard doesn't have any extra fan headers on it. To do this, I'll be using one of my DIY fan splitter boards that I created for my new NAS to do a very similar job to what I'm doing now, connecting 4 80mm fans to a single fan header on an OEM motherboard. And if you're wondering where I got this fan splitter board from, I got it from the sponsor of today's video, PCBWay. PCBWay offers several different high-quality manufacturing services at reasonable prices. As their name would suggest, they offer PCB manufacturing services, which I used to get my fan connection PCB, but they also offer several other services, such as 3D printing, CNC machining, PCB assembly, and more. I printed the 3D printed parts in this video on my own 3D printers, but if you don't have a 3D printer and find yourself really needing a 3D printed part for a project, PCBWay is a great place to get your part from. Plus, if you need a PCB for some custom wiring, their quality is exceptional. One last thing, for the month of July, PCBWay is celebrating their 10th anniversary. There are chances to get some coupons, win some gifts, and to mark where you are on the globe, and to share a photo of a cool PCBWay project that you've done. Definitely check that out at the link in the video description. This board I made is highly versatile, supporting a 12-volt supply that can come from an external source rather than the motherboard's header, as well as PWM control and RPM reporting. The fans I'm putting in here won't use these features and would be pretty easy to wire up even without a PCB. However, I want to install this into the system so that my friend could use PWM controlled fans in this system in the future if he decides to do so. Also, a real quick note, both me and my friend work with electronics like this quite often, so it's not like I'm throwing this custom wiring at someone who wouldn't be able to understand it. I soldered headers to the fan splitter PCB and then connected it to one connection of this regular PC fan splitter. This will allow the CPU fan to be connected to its header while that header is also providing power for these 4 front fans. I finished by terminating the fans with some female headers, and then I mounted them into the 3D printed front panel, leaving me with this contraption. I then connected all of the fans to the fan connection PCB and wrapped it in electrical tape to keep it from shorting out on the case or any other part of the computer. Also, I did go back and redo this electrical tape after filming because I wasn't too happy with how this semi-rushed job came out. After that was done, it was as simple as reinstalling almost all of the parts of the computer. I say almost all of the parts because there are a few components that cannot be reinstalled due to this front panel mod, such as the front USB and audio connections, as well as the DVD drive. The front USB connections will cause an error at startup, which has to be cleared by pressing F1, though since this is a server which shouldn't be rebooting too often, it won't be too much an issue. The final parts of this build now are to install my testing SSD so that I can run Cinebench, and to plug the power button in and run it out of the back of the case, because sadly, this new front panel has no proper spot for the power button. I then installed Windows 10 and ran Cinebench R23 just to see how the 4670 compares to other CPUs and in particular the 4590. In R23, the computer scored a multi-core score of 3240, which is slightly faster than one of my old i5-4590 benchmarks. This seems to line up with how the 4670 should be performing, which is good to see. Throughout this test, the chip also remained in the low 60s in terms of temperature, which is a really good thermal performance. And finally, in single core, the chip scored 840 points. So, the system is working perfectly and is scoring about where it should be in benchmarks. This means that now, it's time to put the final touches on this system. My friend gave me 2 drives to install, a blank 120GB SSD, and a 2TB hard drive that has some files on it that he may want to go through and save. So, to finalize this build, I'm going to be putting the 2 drives into the computer, and then I'll finish off by installing Windows on the SSD so that he can easily navigate through the hard drive before wiping everything and reinstalling with Linux. I quickly modeled up some plastic spacers and 3D printed them so that I could mount the hard drive in its proper 3.5-inch drive bay. And now that they're printed out and installed, this hard drive won't be going anywhere anytime soon. As for the SSD, well, we're just gonna set it in an empty spot on the case for the sake of easy access, totally not laziness. And then I quickly put Windows on the SSD, and the system is complete. This was certainly a pretty fun project and definitely a fun mod to do to the system. I'm not sure if it's the most practical thing in the world, considering the sacrifices that you have to make for this mod in terms of power button placement and front I/O errors, but it's absolutely a fun thing to have built. This system is now ready to be given to my friend, and hopefully he'll enjoy it for his entrance into home servers. And don't worry, I'll also be giving him all of the extra parts of this system that were kicked out by the front panel mod, just in case he chooses to change its configuration down the line. Well, that's all that I have for you in today's video. I hope that you were able to at least enjoy it and maybe even learn a thing or two. In any case, I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.